Okay, welcome to Philosophy Roulette. I believe this to be episode 20. Although I did screw that up yesterday. So, my counting skills may not be where they should be. Something a little different. We're not going to be doing something random I find off of the fill papers. Oh, that was interesting. Yeah, I had a recommendation from some feedback from one of the viewers. So they said, "Hey, you want something crazy to read? You should read this essay by Hud Hudson called An Essay on Eden." So I don't know what this is, but that's why it's roulette. So here it is. A little update on the status of the stream. You can, if you join and you want to read along or get the paper now, you can go over here to the chat. If you type in !paper, as long as I up this, you see that you get the nice little link here to the fill paper page. You see right there. That's, well, you might not be able to see it, but you can, if you click here in the chat, you will be able to get to this page here, and then you can get the paper, which is easy enough. Actually, you have to click on the Google Scholar thing, but it's right there, so you can get it. Simple enough. So here we go. I have to download it. And there we are. So, Faith and Philosophy, Journal of the Society of Christian Philosophers, An Essay on Eden by Hud Hudson. 15 pages, really not that long. Okay, that's good. Let's read the abstract, why not? Despite an impressive tradition, modern literalists about the Garden of Eden have come under severe criticism and ridicule on the grounds that contemporary science has thoroughly discredited such a view. Accordingly, the prevailing trend in modern theology is to dehistoricize the fall. I am no fan of this literalism, but in this paper I argue that the grounds are in need of supplementation by a piece of metaphysics that has not been adequately defended. Absent the additional metaphysical thesis, it is possible to grant all the alleged implications of our modern worldview, informed by physics, astronomy, chemistry, geology, and biology, and nevertheless remain a proponent of literalism without becoming a proper object of ridicule. Well, no one wants to be a proper object of ridicule. That is a noble pursuit, not to be an object of ridicule. Although it does happen, it can happen any old time. So maybe it's not the best thing to avoid. Sometimes you always end up being a bum sometimes. Not to make fun of bums. Bums are okay. You always end up an object of ridicule sometimes. Or if still ridiculous, the status will have to be established by discrediting a piece of metaphysics and not by admiring the fruits of empirical science. Oh no, we're going to lose science if we lose stuff. Okay. Science isn't going anywhere. So, sometimes you find yourself in a debate featuring several competing views. You have a horse in the race and you're doing your best to back your favorite. But it seems to you that one of the other views that you don't endorse has been treated unjustly. Perhaps you think it has been formulated properly, or it hasn't been formulated properly, or perhaps you think it has been formulated properly, but owing to the undistinguished credentials of its proponents, it hasn't received a fair hearing. Or perhaps you think it has been both successfully formulated and heard, but that it has been too hastily dismissed on inadequate grounds. Nothing new there. Nope. That is typical. Occasionally, though, this dismissal becomes so popular and so contemptuous that it invites ridicule both of the position and of its former adherents, and should anyone be foolish enough to continue to express any sympathy for the view, it invites and sustains charges of irremediable stupidity or perhaps even wickedness. I like that word though. I should use it, but I can't say it. Understandably, even though you don't endorse the view, and if in fact you would like to see it refuted, you may develop an interest in trying to help rescue it from the fate of being cast aside for insufficient reasons, and in trying to interfere with the constant bad-mouthing of its would-be champions. You know, I like this because I hate bad argumentation. I hate bad arguments. I don't care what side they're on, just don't make bad arguments, please. I'm begging you. Make good arguments. Even if it's a crap subject, make good arguments. Please. The present paper revolves around an example of this kind. First, let me say something about the kind of argument that generates such a contemptuous dismissal. See? Yeah, I didn't even read this yet. Arguments generate contempt. They do. It's an interesting thing. Like, why should an argument style generate contempt? Like, this is a very strong emotion for something that doesn't seem like it should, but it does. Every once in a while, one encounters a particularly aggressive brand of atheism that mistakes some amorphous thing called our modern worldview for an invulnerable fortress, sets up residence there, and then launches volleys from the apparent safety of its walls against various Christian doctrines and themes. Some of these offenses are sophisticated and challenging, some are not, and some appear to be more sophisticated and challenging they are. Nothing new there either. Here is the central form of one kind of argumentation in question. Christians believe that P. This is a generic. We were talking about that earlier in an earlier episode. Generics. It's very hard to refute generics. Our modern worldview implies that P is false. If 1 and 2, then we are justified in believing that the Christian belief that P is false. Believing that the Christian belief P is false. Hence we are justified in believing that the Christian belief that P is false. It is stated this argument form might well be thought to have a few vulnerabilities. There are, of course, numerous and long-lasting disputes on the minimal belief conditions for being Christian, and thus substitutions on premise 1 are likely to prove controversial. Moreover, divergent opinions on the elusive referent and epistemic status of the phrase our modern worldview, featured in premise 3, are certain to generate disagreement concerning its power to undermine justification in those beliefs it contradicts. On the present occasion, however, I will be content to let the premises 1 and 3 alone, and instead I will direct my critical remarks at what will play the role of premise 2 in the argument examined below. If you were asked to identify a view that has the double feature of being intimately connected with Christianity in the popular mind and of being the subject of almost universal rejection and withering criticism generated by an argument of the form just described, you would be hard-pressed to find a better response than the following story, which I here present without the pretense of precisely representing any special traditions or historical figures' take on the events, but rather in a popular conception, mixed bag, hodgepodge sort of way, making the view all that much more of a target. Once upon a time, there was a privileged and sacred place that played a unique role in the divine plan, a garden planted eastward in Eden. In the midst of this garden, God placed a man formed from the dust of the ground. God instructed him to care for the garden, provided him with a helpmate and companion, and forbade him to eat one fruit, that of the tree of knowledge. But although these our ancestors were made just and right, sufficiently to have good, though free to fall, they rebelled against God, and in doing so damaged themselves and their progeny in a way neither they nor any of their descendants could rectify on their own, for this disobedience was punished by a banishment from the garden and the laws of a certain innocence, immunity, safety, and grace. Thus, through sin did disease, suffering, and death come into our world. Oh noes! Nowadays, we're informed that no one save the incurable rubes I mentioned earlier can give this story any credence at all, to the extent that this or that untenable aspect of it is really bound up with Christianity proper. Well, so much worse for Christianity proper. Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know any literalists when it comes to the Garden of Eden. I hadn't thought of it before because, frankly, I think the premise of this paper is an accurate description of reality. I don't know anyone that takes it seriously, and I mean, heck, I'm Jewish, so. And I guess we would believe in that too. I wouldn't know, I'm not much of anything. And it would seem that those in a position to reply on behalf of Christianity proper have largely adopted a strategy of retreat. I'm certainly no authority or spokesman on that tradition, and I'm not any authority or spokesperson on any tradition at all, not even my own or anything I think. I'm confused and silly. But my own views follow from this path of retreat as well. I take the Adam and Eve story in almost all of its detail to be mythical. Although, insofar as I believe the construction and preservation of that myth was conducted under the influence of the Holy Spirit, I take it to have special significance and to touch us on topics of consequence to all human persons, near, far, past, and future. While admiring memorable devices such as talking snakes and luscious yet forbidden fruits, I take the primary function of the myth to document the occurrence of a historical event involving our ancestors, namely their falling away from God and their separating themselves and their descents from the divine presence. Whether this fall was embodied in some special individual or pair of individuals, whether it was accompanied by the loss of preternatural gifts, whether it was marked a sudden change in the biology or genetics of its participants, or in the environment in which they lived and died, or in the laws that governed that environment, are all questions on which I am willing to take no stand whatsoever. Excuse me. To be fair, such retreat isn't an exclusively modern phenomenon. It is my understanding that the current inclination to regard tales of the Garden of Eden as charming and quaint allegory has early roots in prominent figures in the history of Christianity. Philo in the 1st century, Origen in the 3rd century, and St. Ephrem and St. George of Nyssa, both in the 4th century, all advised a non-literal interpretation of the story of the garden, its tree of life, its stunning variety of flora and fauna, and its remarkably well-behaved wildlife. Yeah, that would be interesting. Well-behaved wildlife doesn't seem very wild, then, does it? Anyway, but then again, equally prominent early literalists can be found with Saint Theophilus of Antioch in the 2nd century, Saint Irenaeus and Saint Hippolytus, both in the 3rd century, and Bishop Epiphanius in the 4th century, all arguing for the claims that paradise was beneath the heavens, its garden, trees, rivers, all materially created things, and its genuine location eastward in Eden a historical reality. I didn't know it was in the eastward part. Oh well, that's good to know. Eastward in Eden. Moreover, and significantly, it is my understanding that throughout much of Christian history, its leading figures have tended towards realist over figurative readings of the garden passages in Genesis. Undoubtedly, much of this consensus can be traced to the qualified endorsement of Augustine and the heavy endorsement of Aquinas, with the Bishop of Hippo and the angelic doctor both fully acknowledging the spiritual meaning of the story while firmly insisting on the materiality of the tree of life and on the corporeality of the rivers watering a spatially located garden. Notwithstanding such champions, traditional reasons for finding realism attractive have always been controversial. Nevertheless, they have been compelling to many. The justifications range from applying widely accepted principles about what factual lessons may be appropriately drawn from the different forms of narrative found in the scripture, to generate arguments to the then best explanation of the origin of species, to providing a temporary home for Enoch and Elijah, notably for being taken out of this world prior to their deaths, joined by the saints and martyrs, to furnishing a way for Christ to keep his promise to the good thief without thereby requiring a doctrine of immediate judgment and resurrection, to making a truth-teller of Paul and his tale of a third heaven in 2 Corinthians, to reconciling various claims in Revelation with what was already well known about the world's inhabitants and laws, to serving as a place of rest without decay for the bodies of the departed, at least in certain of their parts, to lie in wait for the day of judgment and hopeful resurrection. I have to say, I understood absolutely none of this paragraph. I'm sure it's all historically accurate, but, I don't know these things. I mean, I take it these are just, this is just the history of the literalist understanding, but I don't know anything about this. That's okay. If this is just a historical thing, this is like a big reference list, which is fine. There are many big reference lists, and I don't read any of those papers. Or I haven't yet, at least. While running unopposed, as it were, generations of devoted and extravagant proponents of a historical Eden authored flowery passages on the characteristics of the garden and fought bitterly against the spatio-temporal location of paradise, passages and arguments that frequently contain considerable more detail than the available evidence might have warranted. Despite these intricate and fascinating battles over geography and chronology, a commonly shared presumption among the combatants was that wherever Eden was located, the sin of our predecessors had rendered it inaccessible to us, its paths now barred by a flaming sword and cherubim charged with making its entrance impassable to all flesh. Of course, agreement on the impassability doctrine would lead to a conviction that a certain kind of resolution to the dispute on the location was simply unattainable. With cherubim on patrol, it's not as if the winning theory simply awaited verification by expedition. No, that's not fair. If you found the cherubim, you'd be like, well, it's over there. We can't get by the cherubim. But like, if you found the cherubim, you'd be like, that would be, I think, pretty good reason to think that on the other side, or whatever the cherubim was like preventing you from doing, that's exactly where the Garden of Eden would be. Is the cherubim also impossible to find? I don't know. Inevitably, however, the wild exuberance of the Middle Ages and the remarkable ingenuity of its realist representatives gave way to a sobering this-worldly orientation of the 18th century and to apologetic and more scientifically informed Christians who, feeling the pressures of that oracle, our modern worldview, were willing and even eager to retreat to a symbolic reading of the Genesaic garden. Never seen that locution before. That's kind of cool. Unsurprisingly, a primary catalyst for this turn of mind in the history of Christian thought was buried in the fossil beds and in what they appeared to say about the age of the earth and the absence of a great deluge, the origin of species. The age of the earth has been a long argument, actually, because people want to know this stuff, and so this has been a very contentious topic. I mean, at least in philosophy of evolution, on origin of species, it's a big deal. Or to focus on a historically perplexing example, consider a mighty stumbling block for the Renaissance pastime of rediscovering the location of the garden on Earth. Given the assumptions then in play, the garden must have been magnificently large in order to house a stunning variety of beasts and plants, and water enough to supply 4 major rivers. For a variety of reasons, non-literalism has prevailed. Yeah, I mean, if you have 4 major reasons, that's a lot of water. However, how might we briefly state the case then from our modern worldview to the denial of our story? Perhaps as does Ian McFarlane when explaining the trend in modern theology to dehistoricize the fall. An obvious objection to the ideal of original sin is that it depends on a fallacious account of human history. In both its Eastern and Western formats, original sin refers to a historical act committed by the first human pair, the effects of which are passed on to all subsequent generations. The plausibility of this claim is undermined by the contemporary scientific accounts of human origins, which deviate from that recorded in Genesis. It is now beyond dispute that there was no point when human existence was characterized by immunity from death, absence of labor pains, or an ability to acquire food without toil. Nor are the facts of evolutionary biology consistent with the descent of all human beings from a single ancestral pair, monogenesis. Instead, the best available evidence suggests that modern humans emerged as a splitter population from pre-existing hominid groups within the last 250,000 years. The geological record makes it clear that natural disasters, disease, suffering, and death long antedate the emergence of the human species. It follows that such phenomena cannot be interpreted as the consequence of human sin. Although the timescale of human evolution vastly exceeds that of Genesis, the emergence of Homo sapiens remains a very recent development in the several billion-year history of life on Earth, and nothing suggests that the humanity's advent occasioned any change in the basic conditions of biological existence. That is nicely said. Such a summary of the deliverances of empirical science of physics, astronomy, chemistry, geology, and evolutionary biology encourages greeting any remaining sympathetic talk of a historical garden with a mixture of pity and condescension at best, since it betrays such culpable innocence of what is now common knowledge. And with open, unreserved hostility at the worst, since it endangers our children and society in ways that aren't always carefully enumerated, but that we can be sure are immediate and threatening. Well, I mean, it's very clearly what the denial of science has gotten us in this country. Currently, I've left the house for like 20 minutes in the last week. I'm not quarantined myself, but like, it's just bad. Okay, that's not true. Less more than that, but yeah, there's not enough science testing for these sorts of things, and now we're in trouble for it. So that's a setup. I would now like to attempt to show that this argument from our modern worldview to the denial of our story is inadequate. In particular, it misrepresents itself as a contest between religion and empirical science, a contest we are all too often to regard as akin to a match between a toddler and an 800-pound gorilla, when in fact it requires supplementation by way of a piece of metaphysics that has not been adequately defended or even acknowledged. Absent the additional metaphysical thesis, it is possible for a proponent of the story to grant all the alleged implications of our modern worldview, informed by physics, astronomy, chemistry, geology, and biology, and nevertheless to retain adherence to the story without becoming a proper object of ridicule. Of course, if still ridiculous, the status will have to be established by discrediting a piece of metaphysics and by admiring the feats and not by admiring the feats of empirical science. Okay. Brief aside. In this respect, I think our present topic bears an interesting resemblance to debates between the empirical scientists and the metaphysicians. To illustrate, imagine that from the armchair you have worked your way to the belief that P, but it has recently been brought to your attention that physicists have been saying that not P. What to do? First option, be thankful you live among physicists who can instruct you on what to think and proclaim to one and all that not P. I would not suggest just taking physicists at their word. I mean, maybe you're talking to a metaphysician here, but careful on that one. I mean, they're excellent at some things, not so excellent at other things. Second option, worry about whether the experts have been quoted correctly. Always, I suspect, a good option to explore if one comes upon the information by way of some popularization or other genuine scientific work. Oh, shoot the messenger. Okay. Third option. No, this is a very reasonable thing to do. I mean, make sure the person's been quoted correctly before making a decision about what they actually said. Yeah, it's like trust but verify. Third option, acknowledge the accuracy of the quote but suspect that the speakers are overconfident about the strength of their evidence for the position in question, perhaps on general skeptical grounds or perhaps on grounds specific to and unflattering of prominent physicists. It's not as if I think this scenario is often more likely than not. I'm just surprised to see it so frequently regarded as the round square of the options, that physicists just couldn't be in error about what their evidence supports. Yeah, I mean, there's always interpretational issues, and you may overstate your position at times because, for whatever reason, political, maybe they need to get funding or something. And so they had to build up their theory, and I mean, getting funding is no trivial task, and so sometimes you do overstate your position. I mean, sometimes you ask them, they'll say yes, but I need to do that to get the funding, and be like, well, okay, the funding's good, but you did overstate your position. Fourth option, suggest that in venturing far beyond, say, claims about which items play distinctive roles in physical theories, the physicists are out of their areas of expertise and are speaking as naive metaphysicians in endorsing the position in question. This is reasonably common. People always try to say more than they know. I mean, guilty as charged. Fifth option, maintain that the physicists don't see the controversial metaphysical underpinnings of their scientific results and that they are really engaged in a battle of metaphysics against metaphysics rather than the alleged one-sided embarrassment of physics against metaphysics. Compare the result of the committed presentist or superluminal travel theorist confronted with an alleged implications of special relativity. Yeah, sometimes you not only are out of your depth, but you're just talking. You got confused about your topic too. You start to think you're saying one thing, but you really ventured out into the woods, and you did not realize you lost your solid ground. So that's different. It's not just that the physicists are talking about metaphysics, it's that they've just ceased to talk about physics entirely. So it's like not just physics talking physics and that has metaphysical implications, but they've just not realized that they left physics well behind. In returning to our main topic, then, let me confess that I suspect there is really a metaphysical thesis at issue, and a victory, if victory it turns out to be, for a proponent of our modern worldview will require him to wear at least two hats, one of science and one of metaphysics. Well, that is the case. I don't think you can really get rid of the philosophy and just stick with the science. Okay. Oh, eternalism, presentism, and the growing block thesis are three leading theories in the philosophy of time. I was not, I actually kind of was expecting something of time to come into it, but I was not expecting to, actually see, I wonder if there's an argument from, these theories. I was wondering if it was a thing about philosophy of time, but I wasn't actually expecting to go this way. Okay, whereas presentism holds not only present things exist, the growing block thesis recognizes the existence of both past and present items, while eternalism countenances the existence of past, present, and even future objects. The literature on these matters is rich, the arguments deep and difficult, and the consequences for other areas of inquiry significant. Each theory has its able advocates, all are going concerns in contemporary metaphysics. The moves I wish to make are, I believe, consistent with any of these theories, but they are clearest and most accessible when viewed against the backdrop of growing block. The growing block thesis offers a picture of the universe featuring a space-time volume that increases as time passes. As any given moment, the exactly one time is special, the time associated with the hyperplane on the surface of a block in the direction of its growth. The outermost surface, so to speak, is the new slice on the block. It didn't exist moments before, and although it will continue to exist, it will not remain the outermost surface hence. During its brief instant in the spotlight, before becoming ever more imprisoned in the block's interior, the past, its stock of facts and events are present. Soon they will be forever past and take their eternal places frozen in the block, but for one shining moment they are privileged, balanced on the very edge of being. So, the growing block thesis is, it's like, so basically, there, and the, this is the surface of, time. This is the surface of time, and as the block gets a little bigger, so that's the next moment, and now up here is the this is now, and that was then, and everything above the block doesn't exist. That's the future, and everything in the block is the past. That's why it's called the growing block theory. On some scorecards, the growing block thesis is thought to combine the best features of its primary rivals, like presentism, and proclaims the uniqueness of the present, recognizes objective and irreducible temporal properties, takes tense seriously, and countenances the genuine passage of time. Like eternalism, it furnishes truth makers for past truths, provides relata for cross-temporal relations, and acknowledges the existence of many objects that are not present. Yeah, because the presentists, they only say that the surface, only these surfaces, that's all that exists. Because that's all, and then everything, the past is just gone. In the future, they're not at yet, so there's some vanishingly thin line of present that's moving, that's changing in some way, moving through time. And then the eternalists, you see the dotted line. You see the dotted lines here. They the whole block exists, so everything's just fixed, and we're just moving along the block. That's what the present does in the eternalist picture. So these are properties of the good properties of growing block theory, or the other theories too, but why it's liked. Of course, this very combination of commitments is also alleged to be the source of his decisive refutation, with opponents complaining that if it were true, we absurdly could not know. It is now, or else we'll risk living among zombies in the block. That is, amongst non-present existence with no consciousness. Excuse me. Yeah, okay. Other critiques balk at a privileged present and allege incompatibility with special and general relativity, or else target the endorsements of time's passage, maintaining that the view must be supplemented by hypertime, in which the growing of the block occurs and the rate of passage can be measured. Whereas I judge this latter criticism to be an error, I am nevertheless intrigued by the combination of the growing block thesis and the hypothesis of hypertime. Even if not wedded by necessity, this conjunction of theses initially seems both intelligible and metaphysically possible, and significantly not immediately disqualified by appeal to a modern worldview. What is this hypertime? One sec. The view must be about hypertime in which the growing of the block occurs. Okay, yeah, because time is in the block in some sense it's changing, so you have to be outside of time to show the block growing would need another time dimension to show how our time is changing within that time, I guess. You'd be out of time in some space, in some sense, not place. I don't know where you'd be, because anywhere you would be in the block somewhere. So this whole view has to be in some sort of bigger dimension. That's fine. I mean, physics posits lots of dimensions, so this would just be one bigger on both the space and time scale. That's fine. Entertaining our combination view, we maintain that reality, or the block, grows by a certain number of standard events per second. Oh, I don't know if I'd agree with that. Standard events? What's a standard event per second? And that it normally hypergrows at a certain number of tick-tocks per second, where a tick-tock is an interval of hypertime, as a second is an interval of time. Okay, so we're just in that space, in that time. It has some sort of magnitude. Recent literature reveals that the intelligibility and metaphysical possibility of this combination has also intrigued others, especially those who hope to exploit the resources of hypertime not to respond to a call for time's rate of passage, but rather to account, and in a very satisfying way, for backwards time travel. Okay, so if you want to, you're in this big thing, I got you. So you're in this thing here, and if you want to go, back here, you need to go, around to go back here. Yeah. That would be fun. Well, it'd be a fun theory to work on, I guess. I can see why in a very satisfying way. The crucial observation, both in those discussions of time travel and our present investigation, is quite simply that whereas for each instant of hypertime, the facts about what is past and present are determined by the features of the block in existence at that hypertime, the features of the block at one hypertime need not constrain its features at other hypertimes. Illustration of this point is more difficult in the time travel scenarios, which are often complicated by further factors and are not embedded in a theistic discussion. Fortunately, though, God is front and center in our story and perhaps is able and willing to do the heavy lifting. Allow me to explain. Oh, so Eden's in hypertime. Omnipotent as he is, God has it within his power to bring about any state of affairs consistent with his essential nature. Insert accepting clauses into the claim if you are a libertarian on free will or a fan of indeterministic devices. Yeah. The growing block, like each of its contents, is a contingent entity. Any given hypertime, at any given type or hypertime, there could have been no block at all, or the same block with different contents, or the same contents in a different block, or a different block with different contents, or a piece of the old block surrounded by bits of new one, and so on. Moreover, apart from you could move the block 3 inches left in hyperspace. Would that still be the same block? We don't know. Moreover, apart from sequences consistent with the divine nature, there are no metaphysically necessary rules on how things look blockwise from one hypertime to the next. God's powers of creation and annihilation extend from seamlessly replacing one block in another hypertime to destroying large portions of a block's leading edge at a hypertime instant to altering large portions of everything but a block's leading edge at a hypertime instant. It is this final case that will prove to be of interest to us here. Okay, so we're going to alter large portion of it. Alright, so let's just give this a little bit of a highlight. Altering large portions of everything but a block's leading edge at a hypertime instant. So what we're going to have is we're going to have multiple converging blocks, where we were having an Eden block over here, and the sciencey block over here, and then God's just gonna swap. There's gonna have at a point, God's gonna swap the humans into the sciencey world, and that will give us the history of Eden in time, but not in the lineage of the scientific world. Okay. As a warm-up exercise, let's suppose that God's creative activity has taken the following form. At hypertime h0, God created the very first slice, or more carefully, hyperplane, at the very first block in hypertime history and set it go. Standard events transpired as standard events are wont to do. New hyperplanes charted the block's growth. Time began slipping into the future at a rate of n standard events per second, and at the seconds shuffled, tick-tocks, shuffled by a state of 1 second per tick-tock of time. Okay, and per tick-tock of time. After 1 minute had transpired at age 60, is this second or tick-tocks? Oh, it doesn't really matter here. God brought into existence a solitary angel. After another minute had transpired at age 20, God brought into existence a second angel as companion for the first. After observing their interaction for yet another minute, H180, God annihilated the hyperplanes corresponding to the 2 minutes of the block nearest the leading edge and replaced them with a single slice inhabited by 2 angels. God then observed their interactions for a final minute, at which time it was also H240. Figure 1. Ooh, pictures. Figure 1 provides an image to orient you in which the vertical axis represents time, the horizontal axis hypertime. As is customary in such figures, one spatial dimension has been suppressed, and thus our 2 familiar trio of spatial dimensions at any time represented by the perfectly square 2-dimensional cross-sections of the block corresponding to the time on the vertical axis. What can be said of the world at this point in the theory? So, yeah. You got one, so you got start of the universe, and a little bit later we got one angel, a little bit later than that you got another angel. They hang out for a little while. The bottom of the block gets chopped off, and then at 240, I don't know what happens at 240. Which time it was 240. Okay, so yeah, this is the same thing. Okay. Did I miss anything? No. What can be said in this point in the story? In response to this question, we would do well to insist on 2 rather difficult replies, sharply separating what is true about the past at H240 and what is true about the hyperpast at H240. First story first. At H240 prime, the block is 2 minutes old, even though at the hyper earlier H180 it was 3 minutes old. It is now and has always been true that there was never any solitary angel in existence, for there exists only a pair of angels who are exactly the same age, both 1 minute or 60 tick-tocks old. Second story, at H240 prime, it is hyper now and the hyper historically true that there hyper was a solitary angel in existence, despite the fact that every angel that has ever existed has a companion at all the times it was ever present. Well, in regular time, yes. Not in hyper time, because in hyper time, there was an angel for a minute still. Okay. Yeah. The hyper was a solitary angel in existence, but there wasn't hyper there. In the regular time, only in hyper time was there a solitary angel. These perplexing pronouncements escape contradiction only by being carefully sorted into claims about what is true now and what is true in the past at a hyper time. Facts that are fixed by how the block that is present at that hyper time is constituted. Facts that are fixed by how the block that is present at that hyper time is constituted. Maybe this is why the person asked me to read it, because it's tongue twistery. And into claims about what is true hyper now and hyper historically, facts that are fixed by how the blocks that are present at successive hypertimes are constituted. Note also that from the perspective of hyperhistory, the block twice had the property of being exactly 1.5 minutes old. This hyper occurred at H90 and hyper again at 210. Moreover, at these two hypertimes, the block was exactly the same at all its regions corresponding to the first minute of its history, yet different at all its regions corresponding to the remaining 30 seconds of its history. Whereas hyper earlier, it contained a solitary interval during the 30-second interval. Hyper later, it didn't. Absent hypertime, the slogan "If now past, forevermore past" is secure and true, but with the hypertime backdrop in place, the slogan "If now hyperpast, forevermore past" falls to counterexample, provided the right sequence of blocks lined up in a cooperative way in hypertime. Yeah, because you can swap out histories. Or you can lose history, swap out histories. We should now be primed for the application of our metaphysical picture of time and God's powers of creation and annihilation to our main theme. Consider the following hypothesis. In the beginning, perhaps not at the first hypertime, but at the first hypertime to contain a block universe, God created a space-time and its contents whose early stages of growth witnessed the forming of a man from dust of the ground and the planting of a garden into which he was placed, the adorning of that garden with trees and rivers, and the imposition of restriction on his diet, the presentation of and naming of the animals, the extraction of a rib and creation of a companion for him, the fateful discourse of a snake, and a rebellion which took the form of eating an apple. And as the block grew, this once naked and innocent pair fashioned clothing, hid themselves and were found, confessed their disobedience, and received the heavy news of its consequences. Finally, driven out of the garden, they and their world underwent a spectacular change. At the hyper moment the pair exited the garden, say at age, well, let's just call that age fall from the Garden of Eden. Why would it be 10 million tic-tacs? God annihilated every piece of the block save the region on its outermost edge, thus occupied by these ancestors of ours, and then embedded that very region and its contents in a new block, a block sporting several billion-year history, replete with ice ages, long-dead hominids, dinosaurs, primordial soups, condensing matter, even a Big Bang. So they went from a Garden of Eden universe to a scientific one. They got converged, as I guessed earlier. In fact, their brave new world, the very block universe that is hyper-present now, is remarkably and accurately described in great detail by contemporary physics and astronomy, chemistry, and geology. Moreover, this special pair of our ancestors themselves had ancestors from whom they descended in precisely the manner taught by evolutionary biology. Yeah, so God would just have to have run evolutionary history backwards in time to recreate some sort of biological history. There's no reason why evolution can't go backwards. If you have that sort of power, like God level power, you can create things that you can de-evolve instead of like evolving. I mean, technically I'm pretty sure that evolution is actually causally closed. There's probabilistic things, but there's probabilistic things in physics, and we don't call physics not causally closed. So the same holds for biology, and so if you have control over that level of thing, you can de-evolve things just as easily as evolve them. I mean, it's just going backwards in time, which in a discussion like this is really not a problem. We've not only going backwards in time, we're splitting and joining times now, like clay blocks. Fill in the rest of the story as a devoted disciple of contemporary science. The new sections of the block are already canvassed to be painted as our modern worldview instructs. We are in a position to concede its correctness on all fronts. So that's a question. I mean, you have to say two things. If you have two histories that are incompatible, then you are sort of in the uncomfortable position of having to agree to two histories. Yeah, but I mean, if you're going to argue against the uniqueness of history, fine. Moreover, if you tend towards a mereological essentialism for blocks, note that nothing hangs on one and the same block surviving the annihilation and recreation of this version of the fall, so long as the new block sports the salient pieces of the old one together with its occupants. And also note that, quite in step with tradition, this version of the fall has profound consequences not just for our protagonist, but for all creation. Again, in the process of entertaining this entertaining hypothesis, we would do well to insist on distinguishing two different sets of claims. Those reporting history and those reporting hyperhistory. Yeah, you have two different histories here. History, for example, indeed reveals that... No, I'm not sure. We're going to have to see what he says right here. Alright, I don't even know. Yeah, Hud looked like a guy, but... Alright, the author says right here. I don't know what the pronoun is. History, for example, indeed reveals that modern humans emerged as a splinter population from pre-existing hominid groups within the last 250,000 years. That is scientifically accurate as far as I know. And perhaps our pair appeared at a unique threshold in this development as the very first creatures also to be persons. To be sure, they never lived carefree lives of safety in a garden, immune from the dangers of a world red in tooth and claw. On the contrary, their existence was one of constant peril, and entirely given over to toil for food, shelter, and the basic necessities of life. But hyperhistory has a different story to tell. This very same pair, once upon a hypertime, lived in just such a garden, in just such an innocent state, blessed and protected by a special grace. Of course, despite tremendous efforts and many false reports across the centuries, no one has ever found the least trace of this original home, for the simple and obvious reason that it never existed. It may have hyper-existed, but well, you just can't get hyper-then from here. Hyper-then. Yeah, but like I was saying earlier, you're in the uncomfortable position of, for those people, and they are in our history, that means before them we have to admit to multiple histories if the argument that, well, they would be the resultant of a history that no longer exists. So in some sense, insofar as they were in that other hyper history, we would have to they would be the resultant of it, and so we would sort of have to admit to two histories, which was not something we normally want to do. Now, assuming God completely destroys the previous block, with Eden in it, then we would have to be very specific in saying that it doesn't properly exist or never properly existed. Like, I'm not sure. It only hyper exist. It may have hyper existed, but well, that's I'm not 100% that we would legitimately, for speaking of Adam and Eve, then Adam and Eve would have two histories. And I don't know if that's what the author would want here. There are many ways to flesh out the story at this point. Here's one. These parents of ours would have no memory of their experiences in the garden, for after all, those experiences didn't happen to them. They hyper happened. Oh, I don't know about that. If you're taking the sliver from the top of one block and the other one, that's still, that sliver is hyper happening to those folks. And memories are drawn from one's past, not always from one's hyper past. Okay, so if it's getting replaced, well, maybe they don't remember. Like, so that's, well, we have to disconnect memory from the individual. That's also a little bit of a questionable thing. Perhaps once repositioned in a newly furnished block, the special couple in our story were among the very first individuals to rise to rationality, to achieve the status of being moral agents, to exercise their newfound capacity to sin. Perhaps one of them can be credited with the original sin, the first in all of history. What an accomplishment. Perhaps it was the sin of disobedience. Perhaps it even involved an apple. I don't think it was an apple. Apples are... it involves some fruit. I don't know if they had apples in the Garden of Eden. That's a different question, though. Examining the contents of the block will tell. If they were happy to satisfy these historical descriptions, in addition to committing the hyperhistorical sin occasioning the fall, our couple would have played precisely the sort of role envisioned for some genuine historical figures or other by those who have abandoned hope of a literal reading of the garden myth, but who maintain nevertheless it nevertheless represents a genuine moment in history when our forebears turned away from God. A reminder, I am one of those people. I am not inclined to countenance hyper time, and I don't believe our entertaining hypothesis is true. I agree that the literal reading should be abandoned and that a pared down historical event stripped of those characteristics offending our modern worldview should be raised in its place. But I don't think our modern worldview is in a position to foist this verdict upon us, since for all I can tell, the worldview is consistent with a metaphysics that permits us to eat our cake and hyper have it too. That is, that allows us to say there never was such a garden, but also that there hyper was. Why is everyone dialethic nowadays? I mean, me included. But like, you're saying something is and isn't, it was and was not. This is not dialethics, it'd be a diatemporal or something. Yeah, that's what this is. This is like, I wonder what the I don't know what the Greek word for time is at the moment. I can't think of it. But like, instead of it's alethic, it'd be diatemporality or something. There are, of course, other routes to rejection of our entertaining hypothesis. I think a proper refutation would be best grounded in some worry about occupation, relations between objects and regions, or in worries about whether causation is supposed to track history or hyperhistory in personal identity across hypertimes. That's what I mentioned earlier. For example, the psychological criterion of persistence for persons seems to be at odds with the details of our story. Yeah, that's the memory problem. Or in some philosophical objection designed to show that the hypertimes of our story are just mislabeled times, whereas the times of our story are something else altogether. Yeah, so hypertime doesn't quite count as what we mean by time. But I mean, given the physics, you can always add another dimension now. So I don't know if the physicists could really complain about this. But again, these topics take us immediately into metaphysical waters. Yes, theological obstacles may surface as well. Aren't the scriptures and the church fathers unnecessarily quiet about hypertime, especially if it has such a lavish role to play? Perhaps, but then again, loading up Genesis with heavy-handed descriptions of hypertime and space-time manifolds might have made it a bit less accessible to its intended audience. Well, I mean, they have these weird day and night things that are going on. Like, the world was created in 7 days. I mean, maybe those are hyper days. But isn't it clear that tradition places the story in our own past and not in our hyper past? Perhaps it's not so clear. Tradition says these events happened, but may prove to be a commitment neutral between history and hyperhistory. Without the resources to say so, tradition certainly doesn't take an explicit stand against hyperhistory, and once the distinction is on the table and choices are to be made, spoils to the victor considerations may select hyperhistory as the best refinement. Still, theological objections may prevail, but as we are endlessly reminded, theology is not science, and if the present olive branch is ultimately dismissed on theological grounds, I simply remind the reader that the primary goal of this exercise was to block the dismissal by appeal to the science of our modern worldview. Yeah, this is basically a time travel of Eden. You've got a time travel theory of Eden here. In closing, I think it's worthwhile to mention a few curious and pleasant features of the hypothesis. Although our past is clearly marked by a history of pain, disease, suffering, and death that long predates any original sin committed by our first parents with the requisite capacities, we may nevertheless continue to investigate the hypothesis that by way of the hyper-original sin, that is, not the first sin to occur in time, but the first to occur in hypertime, did disease, suffering, and death make their way onto the hypertime stage, and in just the way our story above would have it. Moreover, theologians attracted to a thesis of creation ex nihilo, requiring a time at which God existed alone and apart from what is yet to be created, may be favorably disposed hypertime and the resources it affords. There are other traditions that talk about time in this way and how gods existed outside of time or before time. So I heard her talk about that once. I believe it was in an Indian tradition, where one of their gods was said to have existed. I mean, something like before time. I forget which one was the really hard one. One of them made some sense. Like if you were outside of time, it's like, alright, time stops and you're outside of it. But then there was like a before time, and you're not exactly sure what that means. I forget. Maybe it was the other way around. But like, this is not an isolated story to be messing with what exactly time, when God's time amounts to. Finally, given the details of the story above, even though there exists a block that reaches some 10 to 20 billion years in the past, and even though its interior contains dinosaurs and the like, none of those items was ever present on the outermost face of the growing block, for they all came together. In being together. Accordingly, if those theorists who have... Oh, wait. So, there was only one... Yeah, I guess what's happened is the Eden is just getting into a much wider surface, and then that big block with that extra history is there, or there's another block. It doesn't really matter if there were two blocks that combined, and then the Eden block gets deleted, or if the surface of the Eden block just gets massively expanded to have all the other stuff in it and then appear in history, and then the rest of it gets deleted. But it's just sort of details. According outermost face of the growing block, for they have all come into being together. What exactly is that, come into being together for this? According, who said that? Hud Hudson. Okay. Accordingly, if those theorists who have defended the growing block theory from the critics' catalog above are correct to claim that the block's occupants are conscious only when they are located on its outermost edge, yet my past self is not conscious now? Yeah, maybe. Then we also get a solution to the problem of pre-fall animal pain and suffering for free, or nearly for free, since one cost would involve affirming that consciousness had a surprisingly dramatic and abrupt debut into world history. I don't know what this is, but that's not really my problem. Still, all in all, those aren't inconsiderable advantages. But whether any benefit comes from there being hypertimes at which there are no times, or from having both an original sin and a hyper-original sin to choose from when dealing with the thorny problems raised by the doctrine of original sin, or by general creation, or by natural evil, is a topic for another occasion. In conclusion, then, I submit that the argument from our modern worldview to the denial of our story, has been exposed as inadequate. Before we can indulge in the inclination to ridicule or to insist on a simple correction of primitive and outmoded religious views drawn exclusively from empirical science, we have a metaphysical debate to recognize and evaluate. Accordingly, to the extent that one can keep the growing block hypertime thesis in play in the philosophy of time, one can also tell a just so story accommodating both the relevant verdicts of our modern worldview and a full-blooded realism about a hyper-historical garden. Okay, that was fun. As the author said, this is more of an exercise in argumentation than a full-blooded defense of the literal history of the Garden of Eden. I mean, of course, this is relies very hard on the theories of time, and although what it kind of does is points out that the fact that the physicists are more than happy to just keep adding dimensions as they need it means that the religious folks who want the Garden of Eden can also add a dimension, this hyper time dimension, as they need it too, to make extra history, is basically what they're doing. They're making a second history, and they're calling it hyper history, and although it's not the same as what we mean by history, that's maybe okay for them. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I think this was a fun essay, and I'll hopefully be back maybe later tonight, but I'm scheduled again for 10:30 in the morning tomorrow. So hope to see you then. Send me something you want me to read and comment on, and have a good night. Stay safe, folks.